Hey, what is up you guys? ASM here, and today I finally decided that I was ready to do the AoE Shaman guide for PvE. What this guide is going to go over is the basic stuff like talents, glyphs, rotation, and opener, all of which will be broken down into single target, 2-target cleave, and AoE. So without further ado, let's get into the guide. First things first, the stat priority. So obviously intellect's going to come first, spell power comes with intellect, multi-strike, haste, crit, versatility, and then mastery. Haste and multi-strike are pretty close together, pretty interchangeable, but multi-strike nonetheless comes ahead. And versatility and mastery, obviously the worst. You don't want that on really anything if you can avoid it. You can find your best in slot gear list on Ask Mr. Robot. I suggest you make an account on there. It's very helpful, so your raid leader doesn't get mad at you for putting best in slot on something that's not your best in slot. It makes it very easy. It's very easy to use, so I suggest looking there. So let's get started with the talents for single target. We're going to be doing everything from the start. Single target for talents, glyphs, rotation, and opener. So for the talents, for the 15 talent, you're going to want to be using Nature's Guardian. The 30-second proc is, well, amazing compared to the other two. Astral Shift is extremely situational, and if you're loading the rotation, you don't really want to be using something that requires you to push it anyway, since Nature's Guardian is a passive. For the 30 talent, it's entirely situational as well, but if you don't know the fights, I suggest using Windwalk Totem as just kind of a default, since it's way more frequently used than either of the other two. If you ever get snared or someone else gets snared, rooted, anything, you can use this and it will be very appreciated by your fellow raiders. For the 45 talent, I suggest Totemic Projection. You can throw whatever totem, usually a elemental totem, Storm Elemental or Fire Elemental, just to make sure it doesn't time out. And since the other two are, well, kinda useless, especially Persistence, it's, well, entirely useless in most situations, unless you're using Storm Elemental and you use Windwalk at the same time. And Call of the Elements is only useful for really resetting Windwalk or Earth Grab. So I suggest just using Totemic Projection unless you know for a fact you're going to be using the other ones at some point. 60 talent. For single target, you're always going to want to be using Elemental Mastery, especially now that it lines up with Ascendance and the ring, the Legendary Ring. It's just better than both the other by far. Single target wise, it's just amazing. For 75 talent, you pretty much always choose Ancestral Guidance, and you just use this during high damage phases. But don't worry about it too much. If you're still learning the rotation, you don't want to have to worry about that extra thing unless you just happen to see it and pop it to save your teammates or whatever, unless you have a raid leader who has you set up to do it. But the healing is pretty minimal unless you're AoEing, and since this is the single target part, it doesn't really matter that much. 90 talent for single target is Unleashed Fury. This is really good with Lightning Bolt. That's why it's good for single target, because it's the only situation where you're using Lightning Bolt consistently. And the Lava Burst 10% is kind of a +2. And you can use the actual fire part, the Unleash Flame part. You can use that to refresh a Flame Shock if it's low, or Lava Burst. It doesn't really matter. All you really don't want to do with it is use it on Flame Shock if Flame Shock still has a high duration, because it's just kind of a waste, unless you're doing some stuff with the class trinket, but I'll get into that in the next video. For now, just almost always use it on Lava Burst unless your Flame Shock is about to run out. And for the 100 talent, for single target, let's go with the Storm Elemental Totem for pretty much every fight. This simple guide, I don't want to go into Elemental Fusion because it's very complicated when to use it over Storm Elemental Totem. It's all about fight timings and all that stuff, so just use Storm Elemental Totem, it won't do you wrong. And you also want to use Storm Elemental Totem before Fire Elemental Totem, and with Hero, if possible. So for the glyphs, there is no DPS increase glyph, like direct DPS increase, but I do suggest bringing Spirit Walker's Focus and Spirit Walker's Grace to every fight. You can interchange them depending. The Glyph of Spirit Walker's Grace increases the duration by 5 seconds, and Spirit Walker's Focus decreases the cooldown and duration it cuts both in half. Both of which can be useful in different fights, but if you don't know the fights, you should probably just go with Spirit Walker's Grace, since you never know when you have to run for a while. And you do a lot of stuff while moving, like you can refresh Flame Shock, refresh a totem, use Unleash Flame, or Unleash Fury, whatever it is that you talented into. There's a lot of things you can do during the downtime. You aren't really going to need this too often, but to min-max and Mythic, then yeah, you want to be using that. And as a filler, you can use Glyph of Lightning Shield, because it gives you a fully passive damage reduction, and Glyph of Shocks, just to get that extra far opener if you're starting from further away. So single target rotation. You're going to want to have Flame Shock on the boss at all times, or your Lava Burst does much less damage. It does 50% less damage. That is your main spell, your huge damage increase, so definitely keep Flame Shock at all times on the boss. The next spell on your priority is Earth Shock if it's at 20 stacks of Fulmination, which Fulmination is the stacks on your Lightning Shield buff. You're definitely going to want a weak ore to keep track of this, especially since the tier 18 and tier 17 set bonuses were very based around Fulmination. You're always going to want to use that at 20 stacks. Always. The next thing on your rotation, number 3, is Lava Burst. Just always use it as soon as it comes up, unless you have 20 stacks of Fulmination or Flame Shock is not on the boss. The next thing, number 4, is Earth Shock if it's at 16 or more, but not at 20. So if it's almost at 20, then... if it's almost at 20 but not at 20, then you want to cast Lava Burst before it. But if you don't have Lava Burst and it's almost at 20, you can go ahead and use it. So next on the rotation, after the 16 stacks plus Fulmination, is your Unleash Flame ability with the talent. Since this is a single target part, you're going to want to be using this frequently, pretty much off cooldown, unless you have something else important to do. Next on your rotation is just refreshing Flame Shock if the time is above 6 seconds. This is something you can just kind of do if you have nothing else to do. Next on your rotation is refreshing Searing Totem if the time is above 10 seconds. This is something, even if it runs out, do not refresh Searing Totem. It's just a waste of a global if you have Lava Burst or Fulmination procs. This is something you do in your downtime. And then there's nothing else to do, so the last thing you do is just cast Lightning Bolt. So now let's get into the actual in-raid, like something you don't really practice on a training dummy. Well, you can, but it's the opener. This can be very important, like extremely, if you want to have optimal DPS. The opener is so important. So before the pull, you want to put down a Searing Totem at like 5 seconds on the pull timer. Then about 2 or 3 seconds you cast Storm Elemental Totem or Fire Elemental Totem, depending on which one you have or what you have talented there. Then you use your pot, your potion, and then you start casting Lightning Bolt. But you pre-cast Lightning Bolt before the boss is actually pulled. You cast it at like just after the 2 second mark, or depending on your haste, I guess. But just don't pull early. That's definitely a no-no, because that can mess up other people's pre-pots. Some classes pre-pot right before the pull, and if you mess that up, it's a huge damage decrease for them. So be courteous. If you don't know the class well enough, then don't bother with the precast. So now is the actual start of the encounter. The very first thing you want to do is Flame Shock, Unleash Flame, Lava Burst, and then if you have Fulmination stacks from trash or something, you can use that, but if not, cast Ascendance once all Lava Burst charges are empty. So that is the end of the single target section of this guide. Next part we're going to be getting into is the AoE being 3 targets or more. So let's get right into that right now. Alright, so for AoE, you want to have the same first 3 talents, being the 15, the 30, and the 45. They're all staying the same. There is no real difference. There's no DPS increase other than Totemic Projection, which is the same when you're using a single target most of the time, so that doesn't really change. The only thing you can really do with Totemic Projection is use it to make sure a fire totem is close enough to the boss to have liquid magma hit everything possible, or not necessarily close enough to the boss, but you can put it in between two packs of AoE or whatever you want, you know. It's very helpful. It saves a lot of running and replacing. But the 60 talent is the main difference. Instead of Elemental Mastery, you're going to be using Echo of the Elements. It allows you to put down 2 Earthquakes, which is crazy burst and crazy consistency when you can do it constantly. There's no real extra downside to it, really. 75 talent is the same, it just is much more effective, so you're going to want to be making sure you use this if you're AoEing and there's people taking a lot of damage. Extremely effective. Now for the 90 talent, you want to use Primal Elementalist for the sole reason that Unleashed Fury doesn't do anything, since it increases your damage by Lightning Bolt and Lava Burst, but you're not using either of those during your mass AoE, and the Lava Burst is such a minimal effect. It's 10%. It just doesn't do as much as Primal Elementalist does, and Elemental Blast is just a waste of a cast during AoE. And for the 100, you definitely want to be using Liquid Magma, and it's best to use this off cooldown if you can, but don't use it when there's only like 2 targets. If you could save it for an extra 30 seconds and use it on like 5 targets. It's not that good on low amount of targets, so use it off cooldown if it's optimal, but if not, then save it for mass AoE. So for the glyphs, there's only one glyph difference from single target to AoE, and that being Glyph of Chain Lightning. You only want to be using this if there are 3 or more targets. It is like mandatory, or if there are more than 3 targets, sorry. If there's 4, 5, or higher, you want to be using this because it decreases the amount of damage your Chain Lightning does by 10%, but it increases the amount of targets it hits by 2, so it goes from 3 targets to 5 targets, which is a huge increase. But make sure you do not have this glyph on if there's never going to be more than 3 targets. So luckily, the Elemental Shaman AoE rotation is rather simple. Your first priority is a procced Earthquake, meaning the single target you get from hitting Chain Lightning on 3 or more targets. You want to be using that ASAP. The damage is crazy, you want it on cooldown all the time. The next priority is Liquid Magma, if there are many targets, but you want to make sure you have a fire totem up for at least 12 seconds. And I have a weak aura for this, which will be at the end of the video. I have other weak auras. But yeah, you want to make sure you have a fire totem up, or it's going to stop it early. And then third is just casting Chain Lightning. It's that simple. So one thing about the rotation that I forgot to mention is that if you have tier 18 4-piece, a 20 stack fulmination is right after Earthquake on the rotation priority list, since the haste is extremely helpful in both single target and AoE situations. So now for the AoE Opener, which is a little more complicated than the AoE Rotation in itself. So before the pull, you want to be using Fire Elemental Totem at about 3 seconds. At about 2 seconds, you want to use Liquid Magma, and then pre-pot and pre-cast Chain Lightning if you're comfortable doing so. If you're not comfortable, then skip that part. And don't worry about the Liquid Magma pulling, it doesn't hit the mobs until they're in combat. So after the encounter starts, you want to get down 2 procced Earthquakes before doing anything else. Now you can use your fulmination stacks if you have the tier 18 4-piece, and then Ascendance and spam Lava Beam. And unless the targets are going to die really quickly, you want to just skip the 3rd Earthquake until after Ascendance ends, because it should be on cooldown long enough for the 4th one to not be up until after Ascendance. So you can maximize the Lava Beam damage. But you want to place it directly after Ascendance ends to make sure you don't overlap and get the 4th one off cooldown, while the 3rd one is still off cooldown, because that is just a DPS loss. So now we're done with the AoE part of this guide. We're going to move on to the 2-target cleave part. So first off, the talents are going to be practically exactly the same as AoE, except for the 60 talent, you're going to want that to be Elemental Mastery just because you can't get any Earthquakes down with only 2 targets. You're using Primal Elementalist because of your rotation difference, which I'll go over in a minute, and Liquid Magma is also part of the rotation, which I will go over right now. So for the 2-target rotation, you basically just use the single target rotation, except for Liquid Magma, you want to use that on cooldown, and you use Chain Lightning instead of Lightning Bolt. If they're close enough to hit, obviously. If they're not, you use Lightning Bolt. But you also want to try and keep 2 Flame Shocks up, 1 on each target, but don't sacrifice a 20 stack of Fulmination to do so. Only do it if there's not much else to do. So the 2-target opener is exactly the same as your single target opener, literally exactly the same, except for you want to use Liquid Magma pre-pull. Also, one extra thing about 2-target rotation is it actually increases your single target as well. So if your raid leader calls to not cleave single target something down, as long as the other one doesn't have a downside to dying, you want to be using this rotation because it increases your Fulmination stacks and your Lava Burst procs. The only thing you don't really want to do, because it doesn't really increase your single target, is Liquid Magma. The last thing I wanted to go over was just how you use Ascendance outside of the opener. So during single target, you never want to use Ascendance if you already have a Lava Burst up. You want to get rid of that before using it. And you also never want to use Ascendance if your Flame Shock dot has less than 16 seconds remaining, because it may run out when you still have a Lava Burst up, and that would not be good. For AoE, you want to avoid using Ascendance if you have Earthquake stacks, because it's just not efficient to have to use a global on Earthquake when you could have done it before. So another thing you can do to increase your DPS, it's pretty small, but it's something you can do once you kind of get your rotation down, is you want to make sure that before you pop Ascendance, you get rid of your Fulmination stacks if they're above like 16, just because it's a global that you can use before, and now you can use it on Lava Burst instead. So one thing I see people do very often that they shouldn't be doing is use Unleash Flame during Ascendance. It's not worth the global when you could have used a Lava Burst. However, something I see people not do that they should be doing is using a 20 stacked Earth Shock during Ascendance. It still does more damage than Lava Burst, just like normal, and it's still worth using over Lava Burst, especially because it's an instant cast. And if you have the tier 18 2-piece, don't worry about spam, or it's okay to spam it. Like, don't freak out if you have to spam it over and over again and lose a bunch of Lava Burst. It's still doing more damage. It's still good procs. You know, there's never a time when you want to stop using it and cast a Lava Burst. It's just not worth doing. So the last thing about Ascendance that I want to talk about is using it with Trinket procs. This is something that most people don't do, but it's something you should do if you can, but you don't want to delay more than like 20 seconds to wait for procs, especially if it's not even a good proc. If it's just going to be like a weapon proc or something, you only really want to wait 15 seconds. Unless there is not enough time in the fight left for another Ascendance usage, then you can wait as long as you like, as long as you're going to get the full Ascendance off. So you've probably seen all the weak auras on the background footage, and you may want to have some of them, so I linked them all in the description, and on the Google Doc that will be also in the description. There's much more to the Elemental Shaman than what I put in this video, but I don't think having one super long video would be the most efficient way to do this. The information that's in this video will have you playing your Shaman at maximum potential for DPS, at least a completely viable level for DPS. So before going to the next video and trying to dabble in all the super complicated mechanical whatever it may be, take a little bit, do some LFRs, do some normals, you know, just pug a little bit, do some dungeons, whatever it takes to get more used to the rotation first, because you don't want to overwhelm yourself. You just kind of want to take it one step at a time and figure out your Shaman. So I hope this helps you guys get what you need to get the guilds you want, or get the parses you want, you know, get the DPS you want. Whatever you came to this video to get, I hope I helped you get it. Remember to subscribe and like the video if you want to see more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.